On behalf of the Learning Network and Students for Consent Culture Canada, I would like to welcome everyone to day 2 of the virtual forum. And we're going to start off the next phase of our program with 2 foundational presentations. And then a brief break will be followed by an informative and lively panel discussion. Again, please refer to your forum program that was sent to you to see the agenda, as well as to read more about the presenters and their work. On your screen, you will notice that Ashton Rodenheiser is joining us again today and will be capturing key themes and information shared by presenters and synthesize them into drawings and images. And these will be posted on the Learning Network website with audio descriptions at a later date. It's now my pleasure to welcome and turn the mic over to Seán Kinsella to get us started.
Tanse, everyone. I wanted to acknowledge and say Gichi Miigwech to Norma for those words that come before all else, as I've had my Haudenosaunee friends and siblings describe it, and that for starting us off in that good way, and that reminder of our connection to all of creation and the importance of recognizing, I think, not only when we make mistakes and are part of learning, but also that the gratitude of responsibility. And, you know, even I think what I appreciated about what Norma shared also there was the piece around the fact that we have our own responsibilities when we bring to these things also. So that was, I think, a good reminder in teaching there. I'll ask for the next slide if possible. Oh, I can change it. Okay, I got this. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about conceptually, is consent even possible on stolen land? So this is a little bit, this is the introduction. So I'm going to give a very quick introductional protocol introduction. So Danse was a kone mas kiki natishnakas, ge wasaskote kihu natisiakasan, nahia natia timsamak meti Irish and Dao, and Migazito dem. So I'm Bald Eagle Clan, and I described a little bit about that. I also identify as a Gweo and Agiagamit, which speaks to this notion of one who is currently uncounted. So that's sometimes the way that we talk about non-status Cree people in our community, because we know that there's a history of exclusion for us on our territories in regards to both state violence and also some of our colonial histories there of who received reserves and communities and who didn't, and that sort of piece around colonial policies that engage in violence towards, in particular, Indigenous women. And so the other piece too is I am currently in Treaty 13 territory, and this is where I was born, and my family is from up northern Ontario, around James Bay, and also comes from Treaty 6, which is where they currently still reside, and we're from pretty close to around where the North Saskatchewan runs. And so this is a little bit about me. I always like to do this as a very quick introduction. This is a little about who I am. So I talk about, in this particular case, showing you some of my homelands, which is the top left, some of my ceremonial family, an extended family and clan, which is sort of the bottom right, and then a little bit of Cree humor there. We like the baby Yodas in Indigenous country, Indian country, and so that's a little bit of the language that you can see there that speaks to coffee, and then a little bit more about myself. So that's just, I like to give the visual representation because I think sometimes those words don't really give a sense of who we are. And what I'm going to talk about sort of briefly, given the timing, is asking the following questions to consider for folks. So is consent even possible on stolen land? And what about land in which treaties have not been honored? And then how does cultures of consent relate to Indigenous worldviews and ecological devastation? So What I mean by that, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit, is drawing parallels between violence against our ecology and our land. In Cree, we would say ski. In Anishinaabe, and we might say Shkobenekwe, like these different ways that we describe the earth. But that violence against the earth is correlated and related to violence against Indigenous peoples. And when we often talk about consent-based education, this is really a piece that often gets missed. So folks are often quite focused on the interpersonal violence that occurs. But when you take things from an Indigenous worldview, we have to recognize, and I think this is why, in a lot of ways, Elder Norma's introduction was fantastic, because, really that opening address and the way that we do even our traditional protocol greetings, those reference the lands that we're from. Those talk about the peoples we come from. They talk about our connections to land. And so as Indigenous peoples, we can't be severed from that land. And so the violence that happens to land is also violence that occurs to us. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit and showcase here is a violence on the land, violence on our bodies, which is talking about Indigenous response to environmental violence. And it's a partnership with the Women's Earth Alliance and the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. If you have never heard of the work of either of these groups, I would strongly suggest you check them out. The Native Youth Sexual Health Network has a peer mental health available as well. And they do a lot of really important work, particularly around building safe sex practices and other sort of pieces with Indigenous youth across basically nationally and beyond. So that's where some of the quotes are going to come from. And what I wanted to talk about a little bit here is this idea that reproductive justice, we also have to address the issues of sexual violence, and that the idea of the recognition of free, prior, and informed consent over Indigenous territories, that those are also ways that we need to think about our own bodies. And within an Indigenous worldview, and I'm speaking in particular here for Nahil and Anishinaabe worldviews, so for Cree, when we're thinking about these things, that this idea that consent around people's individual bodies is also related to those environmental harms, and that they can't be torn apart. So often, this is the question, and this particular session and the idea for this actually came out of a partnership with the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, where we went and did a number of speakers and I talked about whether we actually thought conceptually that the idea of consent was actually possible on sort of Indigenous lands, because of sort of the history of essentially violence that have occurred to us as individuals, but then also the land itself. And so when we talk about this idea that the violations of industry on Indigenous lands, we should also talk about the violations of people's bodies. We can't have healthy families, communities, and nations on the land where while people's bodies continue to experience violence. And so, there's a whole list of what we might call sort of like when I was teaching in Indigenous studies, we would talk about them as sort of current issues, but there's a whole list of colonial oppressions and violence that has happened to us as Indigenous people that are both specific to nation and also collective. And so when we think of those pieces, as long as we are continuing to experience that violence, those interventions are always going to create intergenerational trauma that is going to disallow us from having healthy families, communities, and nations. And it's also related to healthy lands. So if we don't have healthy lands, we also can't have healthy families, communities, and nations, because our land base and also the very things that we eat, all of those things that were acknowledged within the sort of words that come before all else that opening, like all of those things impact our health, right? And violence against those things or contamination of those things, all of those things have an impact on us also having healthy families, communities, and nations. And so these things are intrinsically linked. And so when we're listening to survivors of violence, we're also asking them about solutions to land violations and building in teachings about consent that will have healthy nations. Mainstream anti-violence and sexual assault solutions do not address environmental violence, right? It's often talked about as while the environmental movement is over here, and that sort of mainstream anti-violence and sexual assault solutions are over here. But for Indigenous folks, we are the land, and the land, quite literally in our language, we talk about this, is us, right? We are, 98% water, and we are made up of the same elements that the earth is. And so when we are addressing violence on Indigenous lands, we must bring these two issues together and mobilize that response. And in order to increase the recognition of free, prior, and informed consent over Indigenous territories, we also have to sign consent is supported around people's bodies. Because, and I'll talk about this, this piece where, and I think about this from a personal sort of violence standpoint. If as a nation, as an Indigenous nation, the experience that you have had by Canada and other settler states, and those who are making profit from our lands and the things on our territories, when you are brought up that your consent doesn't matter, it creates a real cognitive dissonance, I think, within our nations and within this idea of, and I'll say this, carefully, but the idea that, the same institutions that are supporting sort of nonviolence and sort of anti-violence and anti-sexual assault work and research, are there endowments funding oil and gas extraction, right? Are there the ways that they are doing research is that, potentially contributing to environmental degradation? And the reason that those things factor in together is because this notion that if you don't know how to say no because your no hasn't been listened to on an environmental level, how are you supposed to learn that as an individual, right? And so literally we can see this where when Indigenous nations say no, the response is that we are given injunctions, and the response is typically that if we don't eventually comply with whatever the industrial partner and sometimes the Canadian state have told us to do, that we face egregious state violence. And this is something that's currently in the news because of the Freedom Convoy and those pieces where we face violence to the point where the military and policing is sent in to remove us from our territories, and often from unceded territories where actually the government doesn't have a treaty. And even where we do have treaties, and this is where I asked this question earlier, if those treaties haven't necessarily been listened to, or haven't been followed, then how we can't talk about that as having is not a consent-based relationship. It's like having a relationship agreement with a partner, and the partner continues to violate that relationship agreement. At some point, we have to recognize that that's unconsensual. And so, how do we adjust to this, right? Well, we have to think about what it means to have a more relational understanding. In Cree, we would say it as Wagowatan or kinship, and how we bring that into consent-based cultures. So for myself, that might be the idea of pushing back on individualistic notions of selfhood under capitalism, right? That my family, my specific, nuclear family that is connected to capitalism and is connected to colonization, that we are the most important unit, and that we are the most important thing. In Indigenous communities, and we talked about this before, it's also about responsibility, and what are you responsible to under your family, under your clan, under your nation, and to the earth, right? What is your responsibilities to the non-human beings that surround us also? And I think that's where, when you look at things like the Thanksgiving address, when you look at how we do ceremony, traditionally, it's connected, right? We're connected to placing ourselves not at the center of creation, but placing ourselves as a part of creation, that when violence occurs to the land, we are impacted. We may not be immediately impacted, right? And interpersonal violence, we're almost always immediately impacted. And sometimes with land-based violence, we may not see the immediate impacts for many years, sometimes decades, but they're always there. There's always consequence. And I think that piece around responsibility and building a relational understanding is about the fact that whatever decision and under free will and choice that we make, there is a consequence, right? There is always a consequence to violation. And when we think about what autonomy means, we have to think about, what does that mean fiscally, land-based? The fact that that Indigenous folks under certain legislation are still considered wards of the state or wards of the crown. Are we even considered people, right? And how long have we been considered people for? So when we talk about things like sexual violence and personal violence, for a long time, the kind of violence that we experienced wasn't perceived as being violence because we weren't considered people, right? And so, even under international or national law, if Indigenous people aren't actually humans, and aren't considered full people, then the violence that happens to them, it's not considered at the same level. And so this is also a piece where the more marginalized you are, and there's lots of information about this in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Two-Spirit, and Girls report, around this piece, these connections to genocide and this piece. And so something I'll get you to think about is this piece around how do we do this work at our institutions, right? Are we ready to do this work at our institutions and ask these very tough questions? Because I think this relationship between land and the interpersonal for us, we can't pull them apart in the same way. Like, it's a worldview piece where we are connected to the land and the land is us. But settler colonialism likes to individualize systemic discrimination and issues, because then it allows sort of personal responsibility to be placed on people, whether or not it should be. So, in that way, violence becomes a result of some sort of moral failing in character, as opposed to, and we see this with sort of rape apologists and sort of rape myths and sexual assault myths and those sorts of things. The same kind of stereotypings and sort of myths also exist around the land, right? The land was unoccupied. The land, was empty of Christian folks. Therefore, colonial powers could lay claim to it, right? And that's the framework that we still exist in. So, to me, and this is just my answer to this question, this is where the work of decolonization becomes critically important, because it is about looking at the very structures that make our institutions and holding our institutions and the individuals in them apart, for account for the kinds of violence that we see. So these are some of the resources that I pulled from. If folks wanted to take a look, that's the Environmental Violence and Reproductive Justice Report. And then there's also the Peer Support Manual within the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. So I will pass it over to my colleague, David, to chat about the next little bit.